to answer the question, did the book of Acts expose Paul as a false prophet? Now, just an introduction because we're going to go through Paul's vision. We're going to go through the makeup of the theological framework of Paul. We're going to go through the main event, which is Paul in Balaam and how that structure works. Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, we see Paul focusing on how he received and understood what he saw. Now, the vision that he received, it's new to the Jewish movement at that time, to the new Jewish movement at that time, and it shapes the role of this character, Paul, in a complex way and actually exposes the reason for why he exists. The vision is pivotal to understanding what that new Jesus or Jewish religious movement was, highlighting the transformative impact of spiritual experiences on religious narratives. And the vision also serves as a cornerstone for his later theological contributions. Now, the narrative reveals the lengths Paul went to piece together what he saw. This is a personal experience. It's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be a personal experience. We're going to see that it's really not that personal. And we're going to show that this personal experience is supposed to highlight the dedication and the understanding that this individual character takes in interpreting what he saw for the purpose of his then environment. So then when you look at this vision as a whole, it's simply a synthesis of personal and communal insights. Personal and communal insights, demonstrating how things worked at that time and the vision that this character had for the times after, with Paul being the key figure, supposedly being the key figure in this movement. Now, just going through Paul's vision, some key points. The vision begins with a sudden light from heaven shining around him. The extraordinary event marks the start of his transformative experience. Light symbolizes divine intervention and sets the stage for the unfolding events. Paul doesn't know who he's talking to. He says, "Who art thou, Lord?" Why doesn't he know who he's talking to? Because he's never actually seen the person he's supposed to be representing. So this could be anyone, right? That he's seeing because he doesn't know who. He's saying, "Who are you?" So this is the confusion that this character has, and a confusion that continues and trickles down unto his doctrine or his gospel. You get down to the blindness now that he has, and needing to be led by the hand. Now, this same, I don't have this highlighted here, but this same event of being blinded and darkness swirling about them and needing to be led by the hand, this is the same thing that happened to Bar Jesus, that Paul did to Bar Jesus. It's now happening to him. So this is mirroring a sort of awakening as such, as he's to get out of this state. And he is supposed to arrive into a place where his eyes are opened and where he is now becoming the center of a phase of enlightenment for the purpose of transforming not just the people then there, but the age itself. So the scales, these are not literal. Nothing in this scene we're going to understand that is being described in Acts 9 concerning Paul is literal. These scales, there's no literal scales falling from anyone's eyes. This is figurative for the purpose of what was once old and dead to this individual. Well, it's now coming back revived, regenerated, and resurrected. He's now having a bit of an awakening taking place, which leads to him having hands laid on him. I know we like to believe in the book of Galatians, Paul says that his revelation came to him. Well, the author writing the book of Acts tells a very different story. According to the author writing the book of Acts, hands have been laid onto this individual. We're going to see what that means, but it does not mean that this individual received a vision from out of nothing, a revelation from out of nowhere, a revelation from some direct cosmic entity. The language there signifies a period of brokenness to a period of recovery, and the ones that are there with him, they are the ones most central to his recovery that then allowed him to have the opportunity to receive the kind of foresight that he claims to receive. So these events in Acts 9, they're not literal, they're actually describing a process of enlightenment. and a process of enlightenment that is based off of the judgment of one's imagination. An imagination, I say, that is scripted and held to the age of Tarsus for which this individual is said to be born in, into the Roman environment, and to the religious background of this individual, which is Hellenistic Judaism. Now, the metaphors behind all of this, as this image here of Paul having his hands laid on by the disciples of Damascus, who picked him up and who taught him everything that he knows. This is all in the book of Acts, chapter 9. And I forgot to say that everything within this presentation, it is based off of material that I have previously put out onto YouTube. So if you have not seen those videos, watch those videos. I'm summarizing everything there for the sake of getting to the point of the Balaam and Paul blog post comparison there. The metaphors within this laying on of hands, Joshua received the spirit of wisdom from Moses through laying on of hands. When we're seeing that Paul had hands laid on him, this is figurative imagery. This is metaphorical in nature. This is allegorical to let the one reading know that Paul did not receive anything by any sort of mysterious happening. Everything that he received that he likes to say is a mysterious happening, it happened after he had hands laid on him, or after the disciples of Damascus taught him and infused him with their spirit and their intellect so that he can then take what they had and then move on with it. This is a transference of understanding from one to another. It is a connection of spirituality from group to individual. They now had somebody that had power, that had authority, that was in position to take what they believed and to put it on an imperial platform. Paul had those connections. So that instance again in Acts 9, once you get past that imagery, we're getting down to the fine points of how Paul was taught what to teach, and how Paul, from teaching what he taught, gained better insight by reviewing the things that he said and sort of perfected his cosmic Christ and the theology around that and the mythology around that and the allegory around that to what it is and should be for him and for his community. Now, this is not a real thing. Paul's vision is best understood as an allegory. We're going to see that. It illustrates his reception of doctrine and inspiration from disciples of Damascus. That's not me. That's what the authors writing that are letting us know. The vision is a colorful narrative, not a supernatural occurrence. Paul's experience reflects a mental and spiritual transformation. This transformation was shaped by existing religious movements. The vision serves as a symbolic representation of this change. Paul's vision highlights his connection to disciples in Damascus, symbolizing transmission. Transmission, more than an original and unique composition, it is a transmission of understanding that allowed Paul to then shape what he could, allowing that what was shaped to become as unique and original as it should be and as it was. So Paul had inspiration not from anything divine or cosmic or however you want to think about that. It came from the disciples of Damascus. And what he received from them, then he went on and in his own imagination cultivated a Hellenistic Roman Greek deity, which completely highlights the influence of that age, not simply just on the character itself, but in the literature itself for how things worked back then and for how they still work today. Nothing has changed. Now, the philosophical and religious context of Tarsus I thought to be important. This is supposed to be Paul's hometown, whose main religion was Mithraism. The main religion of Tarsus where Paul grew up, Mithraism. Understanding the context of Tarsus, we then are able to understand the context of the character Paul himself. Because understanding the character of Paul himself and the context for which he arrives We're able to know and get a feel for the landscape, for the environment, for the context of where his thoughts were pointing to, and the influences upon his theology, because a lot of his theology, it's not coming from Genesis to Malachi. You will not find anything in Genesis to Malachi within Paul's framework. Paul absolutely rejects and believes that his Christ fulfills everything from Genesis to Malachi in a very specific way, or I have to say in a Greek and Roman way. Now, this multitude that Paul was accustomed to as he was in his age, he knew a pantheon of Mithra, a pantheon of Heracles and Hercules and of Baal and of Apollo. All of these deities Paul placed into his Christ to be a perfect fulfillment. And it makes absolute sense. Why would he not? This is an individual who was a Hellenistic Jew. Hellenistic Judaism is the blending of Greek and the Hebrew scriptures, departing from the Hebrew scriptures into a genre of its own. Paul, in the age that he is in and surrounded by the environment that he is surrounded by, it's really not difficult to grasp, especially when you see the things that he's saying, the mixing of his Hellenistic Judaism with Greek and Roman paganism. Now, the Mithraism influence on Paul, really not that surprising. Mithraism involves rituals where wine is symbolized as blood, reflecting a theme of sacrifice, something that Paul continues in a Hellenistic Jewish way for Hellenistic Jews. Paul's Christology incorporates similar symbolism in the Eucharist, which originates in Mithraism. Eucharist is Mithra, uniquely and originally related. Paul carried that over. The Paralells suggested Mithraic influence on early Christian ritual practices was very significant. Mithraism featured the concept of a deity who dies and rises, embodying renewal. This is something that Paul again carries over, and we have to remember, right? There is an original movement. There's an original movement, and the original movement is not Greco-Roman. The original movement is connected to the philosophy that is Torah. The philosophy that is Torah. Again, it is connected to the philosophy that is Torah and to the prophets and to the way that they handled their rising prophets. It's not going to be the same way as a Greco-Roman Hellenistic Jew will handle a dying and rising prophet. The individual that is said to be dead and then resurrected, it does not go to the lengths in the original movement, according to the Hebrew scriptures, that the Greco-Roman Hellenistic Jew Paul character takes it to. This motif of a dying and rising universal sin-cleansing figure is not, again, Genesis to Malachi. It is not Hebrew. This is Greco-Roman. And Paul is bringing in a multitude of very fascinating elements, sure, but elements that are deviating from the intent of the philosophy from Genesis to Malachi and from the authors that wrote them. Mithras was revered as a cosmic savior and mediator. Tradition that the Paul character kicks in for his Jesus. Paul portrays his Christ as a universal savior and mediator between humanity and God. This resemblance highlights Mithraism's influence on Pauline thought. Not just the wine, it's not just the Eucharist. There's a lot that one has to factor into that plays into the environment of the Paul character and the theological construct that he set in place for the kind of beliefs that he is advocating for. The ritual type, the savior type, the imagery savior type, the resurrection themes, the resurrection type, constructs between Mithraism and the new pagan Hellenistic Jewish religion, quote unquote, Christian. So these are things we have to pay attention to. And I just have this here just for caveat, Dionysus and Jesus parallels. Again, this is a deity that Paul would have been familiar with. Dionysus and Jesus both embody a blend of divine and mortal elements. They are both demigods. Their stories intertwine historical events with mythological narratives, allowing the reader to believe that what they're reading is real, even though nothing of what they're reading is real. Both figures are depicted as suffering, dying, and resurrecting, highlighting themes of sacrifice and renewal. The cult of Dionysus was centered and based around wine and the things one does with wine when they're in that sort of state of mind that wine can get you in. Again, this sort of symbolism influenced the thought process of the Paul character and how he conceived his Christ being viewed. Now, in Damascus, as he's heading that way, this is the landscape, the initial. Hadad is the central deity of Damascus. Damascus worshipped Hadad, also known as Baal. He was a chief deity depicted as a dying and rising god. On the way to Damascus, this is the chief deity of Damascus, Baal, dying and rising deity. The mythology involves battles against death and resurrection, as I'm sure. If you haven't seen, I've also put out a video on the Baal cycle, showing the process of how Baal becomes who he is continually and cyclically. Baal's mythology was deeply rooted in themes of death and resurrection. These narratives shaped the spiritual and cultural identity of Damascus. These stories were central to the age, and again, the character Paul would know this. Baal's prominence shaped the religious movements of Damascus at that time. Their environment, this environment was what Paul experienced and the kind of cultural context that he was steeped in. Baal worship, Paul's assessment of his age, being the kind of mastermind that he is, did his best to weave and to intermingle everything within his age, with everything within his religion, which is Hellenistic Judaism, with everything within the new Jewish or new Jesus movement that is occurring or that occurred within the land. All of this going on with Damascus, suddenly a light bulb went off in his head. Hey, listen, something's right about what's going on. I feel it. And after that, it was history. Now, the challenge that Paul brings to the reader is one of ideology. Paul faced the challenge of synthesizing gods from Tarsus and Damascus into a unified theological vision. He needed deep understanding, and he had definitely possessed very deep understanding of the culture, both political and religious. His approach aimed to create very coherent frameworks that resonated across traditions. He reconciled Jewish, Greek, and local traditions together, involving complex theological and cultural differences. Mastermind work that his Christ is, in order to bridge the gaps and find common ground among these belief systems. And so he sought out to create a quote unquote composite Lord from the various cults and philosophies. And we can see this if we are actually observing everything that's going on in those epistles that are written by this character, Paul, especially in the book of Acts. We can see all of this sort of machination taking place. And all of this unification of deities was to eventually replace an age of religion, an age of religious spirituality, religious philosophy, religious tradition, to represent something unique. Now, Paul's synthesis, all of this exposes him as an inventor. We can see this. Paul invented the religion of the Jesus character. And he did so absolutely brilliantly. There is no one at that time that could disparage this character. He was Greek. He was Roman. He was Egyptian. He was Hellenistic, Jewish, bicultural backdrop. He was even Indian. He had everything. He was even Chinese. He had everything within him to resonate with all these peoples. And there was absolutely no flaw to the deity that was invented. This new theological system, it refined the age's spiritual beliefs and practices, offering a new perspective of one's relationship to the divine, or to the quote unquote divine. This sectioned out an entirely new movement of its own, original from Hellenistic Jewish teachings and the original Jesus movement itself, something that gets left behind. The fact that this original Jesus movement did not see, and we can know this, they did not see a dying and rising Savior whose blood did anything for humanity. No. They didn't see a dying and rising Jesus ascending on the right hand of anyone. No. None of that. According to the Hebrew scriptures and according to the Hebrew philosophy and according to linguistic Hebrew cultural context, fits into the actual narrative of the original movement itself. The invention of a new movement is what Paul was commissioned to do. And that new movement involved a universal appeal. And that universal appeal required someone to have a bit of a specific talent for doing so. And there was nobody, according to the narrative, more fitting to do so, who lived in an age and in the center of everything. For some reason, despite this same Paul character saying that there were other Jesuses at his time, there were other Jesuses in his age, there were other Jesuses competing with him, he had to continually show that his Jesus was the real Jesus. Despite all of that competition, this Paul's Jesus won the battle. Which brings us to Balaam. Traveling figures, observing similar things. Paul's Damascus experience, it mirrors Balaam's story in Numbers 22. So if you're reading my blog post and you're seeing the things that are there, there's nothing that you can actually pick out concerning ministry, because the issue is not ministry. The issue is literary structure. Literary structure. Both are traveling figures confronted by divine light or angelic presence. Is it an accident that both Paul and Balaam, being called by God, find themselves receiving a vision of a divine figure? Is it an accident that both Paul and Balaam are on a mission to curse this deity's chosen church when that vision happens? Is it an accident that both are outsiders addressing that church? Is it an accident that the author of Acts 9 styles Paul's narrative in a way evoking Balaam, which ultimately subtly critiques his apostolic claim? Is it an accident that both characters are around individuals that are seeing or not able to see what they are not able to see or hear? This is very deliberate. This isn't talking about Balaam is Paul, Paul is Balaam, the two characters are one. That would be false to say, right? But from a literary standpoint, our introduction to Paul, it is mirroring the story of Balaam's travel to curse Israel. As Paul was traveling to curse, Balaam was traveling to curse. Their events happened as they were traveling to curse, and their events mirror one another. Or I should say, Paul copies the events of Balaam's travels directly. This causes us, or should cause us, to question what's going on here. Why isn't the author unique? Why is Paul traveling and then having a visionary experience the same way that Balaam traveled and had a visionary experience. Why isn't this unique? Why isn't the author crafting something better? Well, there's more to that. There's a reason, and it's literary. And that's where my mind is. My mind is literary. Balaam is portrayed in the Bible as a false prophet, known for deceit. Here we have Balaam next to Paul. He led Israel into compromise, steering them away from their covenant. His actions served as a cautionary tale against religious manipulation and betrayal. Now, the New Testament also verifies Balaam as being a false prophet with false teaching. His legacy in the New Testament is used to warn against a type of spiritual character for greed and corruption. Associating Paul with Balaam raises many questions. Again, that association is not saying that Paul is Balaam or Balaam is Paul. I don't know how anybody could get that, especially when reading this blog post, pinpoint blog post saying no such thing. Good thing for this presentation. For the legitimacy is the reason or the angle of why the comparison between Paul and Balaam is not a direct comparison, not a character, not a personal. This is literary. The structure of how Paul is introduced to us, it is the same story of Balaam, the same traveling story. So this raises questions about the legitimacy of Paul's ministry and such. And the scrutiny, the strict literary scrutiny. Paul can't escape this. The character Paul can't escape this because he is framed by the author writing the book of Acts in the same narrative story, script, as Balaam. This should move us to see something. Why? Why is Paul going from one place to another to curse the then chosen church of Israel's deity and having a vision and a revelation of a figure, of an extraterrestrial figure? That sounds like it's happened before. And the one that it's happened before to, Balaam, is regarded as a false prophet. So if it's being replayed in the story and narrative of Paul, the narrative is not that narrative carrying with it a title of false prophet also that should also be placed onto the individual Paul? That's the larger question. The Acts author mirroring of Balaam's story in Paul's conversion, it may serve as a little subtle jab, right? Sort of feels that way. A subtle critique of Paul's prophetic authority. This parallel raises questions about the legitimacy of Paul's role as a prophet, suggesting that Paul's authority, it might be intentionally framed within a narrative of doubt and scrutiny. That's why that's there. It's a literary construct to let the individual know that if it's mirroring the same output of Balaam, the same input is verifying and validating the same character or a similar staged character. The literary device of mirroring Balaam's story frames Paul's mission within contested theological boundaries, meaning that it's highlighting the complexity and the potential controversy surrounding Paul's role in the early Christian movement. This looks very deliberate on the part of the author of Acts. Very deliberate. Very deliberate. It's no different than Joseph of Arimathea placing the Jesus character into his own new tomb when that same story in the Kings is already present, where an old prophet finds the dead body of one of the good prophets of God from Judah and places him into his new tomb. Same story reproduced. That was a false prophet in the book of Kings that took that body and placed him into his own new tomb. The one that was placed into his own new tomb in the book of Kings, that was a disobedient prophet, and he was killed for his disobedience. The mirroring of that same story from the Kings into the Jesus narrative, this allows us to transfer the same echoing principles and titles, from that slain one that was placed into the new tomb to the now Jesus character, slain and placed into his new tomb. This is literary. We got to catch up to this. This is literary. This didn't actually happen. This is literary composition that the authors are using to allow the reader to understand the kind of disposition the characters that they're writing about have initially. It's just a literary device. The parallel with Balaam's story indicates that Paul's revelation may be constructed rather than divinely authentic. This perspective, it challenges traditional views of Paul's conversion as a purely spiritual event because it is not a purely spiritual event. It is simply copy and paste. It is simply plagiarism. Did not take place. And yet, it is placed by the author writing the book of Acts for the purpose of a literary device and tool to let the reader know that the person they're being introduced to in Acts 9 is inauthentic, is not genuine, is contrary to what is fact, validity, and such. This changes everything, or at least it should, when we're looking at the literary composition that the author of the book of Acts, chapter 9, is doing when it comes to the Paul character. There are intentions behind their literary structure. And the intention to mix and mash and especially link up what's going on in Balaam's travels to Paul's travels, that's all my blog post was centered on and focused on. The literary construct and structure of that, it should awaken us to things. Acts draws a parallel between Paul and Balaam, emphasizing deceptive traits. This analogy suggests the author perceived Paul as misleading in his actions. That's why they did that. Such a betrayal aligns with the idea of Paul undermining the original Jesus movement, because he did. These are non-Hebrew type philosophical principles that Paul is enacting. This is an overriding of a movement to place into it a universal and, quite frankly, government-approved religion. The narrative in Acts indicates Paul's role in destabilizing the early Jesus movement, which was his point, which is why he existed. This framing of Paul as a figure who diverted the movement from its original path is something that the author of Acts wanted. This is how the author feels about Paul. You know how we have in 2025, we have this program called COINTELPRO, right? We know about COINTELPRO, a co-intelligence program where individuals are sectioned out to infiltrate certain political movements and certain communities out there, to infiltrate them, to get notes on them, to pick up what they like and don't like, to pick up who are their leaders, to pick up what their philosophies are, to pick up what they love and don't like, and to inevitably diminish them from within. This is Paul's entire thing. He is COINTELPRO, first century AD. That's all Paul stands for. And I'm not just saying that. This is literary. The author of Acts is doing this in a literary way to let the reader know that that's all Paul stood for. Acts frames Paul as a false prophet. The author does this, challenging the legitimacy of this character. This depiction, it's there to make the reader, or it should make the reader question how Paul aligns with the actual original Jesus movement. With the actual movement. The tension between Paul and the foundational principles of the Jesus movement, the way that we are introduced to Paul, because it mirrors Balaam's travels, this isn't about Balaam's ministry. This isn't about Balaam is Paul, Paul is Balaam. This is a literary device of traveling. One travels to curse the then chosen church of the deity. On his way to travels, gets a vision in Revelation. Centuries later or such, literary centuries later, another is traveling to curse the then church of the deity of Israel, or the then supposed church of the deity of Israel, and has a revelation. The same story. Same story. Clearly a copy and paste effort. And it's intentional because the author's trying to allow the reader to know in Acts 9 that the character that's coming onto the scene right now, they are a false prophet, and what they are teaching is not genuine. Now, Paul's Damascus Road experience functions as a narrative tool paralleling Balaam's story. This parallel draws attention to divine intervention in human affairs on the surface and highlighting the transformative power that occurs with what is considered to be or should be or supposedly divine. Paul's Damascus Road experience frames his authority and mission in theological contestation, which is why it's there. This establishes his role as a key figure in Christian theology, which is why it's there. It highlights the challenges he faced in his own self. To go from hating a thing and then loving a thing, from hating a figure that was revered to not only loving the figure that was revered, but adding a mythology to them. This was an honor to them, for them to do in that age. So this experience of Paul, it's highlighting the nature of his claim to apostleship. It's supposed to validate him within the community. It's supposed to be a narrative and a strategy narrative to garner him influence. But there's a problem. That strategy is infused with tales and with stories coming from someone regarded as a false prophet. We could have been introduced to Paul in any way. Anyway, we could have been introduced to him. But the author writing the book of Acts understands what they're doing from a literary sense. They're pulling from the past, not accidentally, but intentionally, to place onto the character that they are writing the philosophical theme that is attached to the character from which they are taking that information from. They're placing reference onto Paul, and one cannot ignore that reference. Just can't. Balaam sought personal gain and was rebuked when comparing these two. His actions were driven by self-interest. He's often seen as a symbol of greed. Balaam's story serves as a warning against prioritizing wealth over faith. His motives were clear and condemned in the narrative. Paul claims divine commission, but his motives are questioned throughout the narrative. This raises doubt to the authenticity of his revelation, or it should. Paul's intentions are debated among his age's own scholars and believers. His story highlights tensions between faith and skepticism. Paul's calling is central to understanding his role in this new movement that he is putting together. Now, the author placing our introduction to Paul in the context of Balaam's traveling narrative with Paul's traveling narrative, this causes some questions to stir. The Balaam parallel in Acts, it subtly undermines Paul's legitimacy. Everything that the author of Acts is doing from a literary standpoint to put a stamp on this guy to make him appear to be credible, they are subtly doing the opposite. And it's weird, brilliant literature. This parallel to Balaam associates him with a figure condemned as a false prophet. This challenges his credibility. Acts draws a parallel between Paul and Balaam, and the association undoubtedly raises doubt of his role or the point of his role in the movement that he was starting, which is why it is so subtly placed into that narrative, because there needs to be tension with this character. Everything that's going to happen to this character after this introduction, it's going to sound marvelous. It's going to sound glorious. It's going to sound like he is a sent messenger. But that's not the case, because our introduction to him cancels all of that out. The author's taking our introduction to Paul and writing it in the same literary framework as our introduction to Balaam. The same traveling scene of Balaam, the author writing the book of Acts places into Paul, not by accident. And this kind of diminishes and should get us to think about the kind of character that Paul is aside or next to the original movement that he was infiltrating. Paul claims to have received the gospel directly through visionary revelation. This revelation is described as a divine encounter, bypassing any sort of human mediators. We know that that's not true, but that's the legend. The author writing the book of Acts, chapter 9, breaks that down for us allegorically. Paul emphasizes the supernatural origin of his message to validate his authority. His experience sets him apart from other apostles who relied only on earthly. Imagine that. Discrediting the original movement from being a valid source because they didn't receive some sort of supernatural, extraterrestrial, cartoonish, cosmic vision of the guy in another land and territory outside of this realm and domain of Earth. This is what is supposed to solidify him as having a special connection to the individual that original movement is about. Now, contrast that with the eyewitnesses, the supposed eyewitnesses. Other apostles base their authority on being eyewitnesses. They recount firsthand experiences of Jesus' teachings and miracles. Their testimony is rooted in historical events or supposed historical events and shared community experiences. Now, this approach emphasizes a tangible, verifiable connection to the Jesus character, sharply contrasting with Paul's reliance on a visionary rather than physical, actual, legitimate encounter. What the author of Acts is doing in chapter 9 for Paul makes this necessary to point out. Because the individual Paul did not know who he was seeing. Come on now. Who are you? Knowing the multitude of deities in extraterrestrial cartoonish locations that the Paul character was associated with, they could have been dressed up as anyone, and they were, into a sort of put together, fragmented, broken together, fragmented again, and then put together new deity that Paul would later call his Christ, erasing the fabric of the original movement before such a celestial figure ever existed, because to the original movements, no such celestial figure did actually exist. Now, the author of Acts employs literary parallels in typology to shape perceptions of Paul. These are techniques created for the purpose of initiating connection between Paul and other figures. This is again used to enhance the credibility of this character, but at the same time, drawing negative connotations to Paul. Acts promotes a particular theological view of Paul's role, highlighting the importance of Paul in the mission of the Church of Damascus. Now, all of this reflects the perspective of not me, but of the author that's writing this, and how they see the Paul character contributing or being a contributor to the faith that then was. These parallels exposing them not actually being too favorable to the author of the book of Acts. When you actually look at what's going on here and what they're doing from a literary sense, they actually don't like Paul at all. These literary techniques, they're critiques. They're critiques of this character, whether or not this Paul character that we're reading in Acts existed, because there is no actual Paul or Saul in world history. This is just a literary fiction character. Whoever the author of the book of Acts is writing about, and whoever they are penning as a pen name Paul, contributing to the movement that then was back then, they are letting their reader know that this character is a false prophet of the movement that is going then on. Now, recognizing the Balaam Paul parallel, it challenges everything we think, right? Because we have to wake up, because it's about time. We see the literary machination going on here from a critical, contextual, and philosophical point of view. The Balaam Paul character, it calls for establishing of groundwork and a reevaluation of this character in and of himself. These origins of what we call the Christian religion didn't begin the way that they're said. The things that are written in the book of Acts are allegorical. All of them. That's not literal history. Again, that's not literal history. The history of these times, they are written and they are covered in metaphorical and allegorical language. To understand the times, we have to understand the language that they are written in. That's why they're written the way that they're written in. So understanding these parallels, and there are many, many more in the book of Acts. The author of Acts has a literary stance that from a fiction mythological point of view or perspective, from a literary perspective, they are articulating in a frame that is creative. Now we can't settle on what is creative, right? We should know the times that we're living in. What we're reading is art. This isn't history. This is literary art. And literary religious art at that. And literary religious art coming from Hellenistic Jews and pagan Hellenistic Jews later taking on the name of Christian. When we're reading these things, we have to understand the age that we're in and the kind of genre that they are written in to be able to get what these authors are really trying to craft. And so we're finishing up this presentation, and what we have just done, what I'm doing in my blog post, what I have done there and here, this is called literary analysis. Now, I've got this simple that I've placed here definition of what a literary analysis is, and it is the study and evaluation of two or more literary works by examining their similarities and differences in themes, style, structures, characters, or other elements. It involves analyzing text side by side to uncover deeper insights into their meaning, context, or cultural significance, often to highlight how different authors, periods, or genres approach similar ideas of how unique contexts shape distinct narratives. Literary analysis. How does that play out? Parallel narrative structure. The author of Acts mirrors Paul's Damascus Road experience with Balaam's encounter in Numbers 22, both depicting a prophetic figure halted by a supernatural vision while on a mission of opposition, suggesting Paul's revelation may be questionable. Balaam's false prophet legacy. By aligning Paul's story with Balaam, a figure condemned as a false prophet in 2 Peter and Revelation, the author subtly implies that Paul's claims to divine authority may lack legitimacy. Divine rebuke similarity. Both Paul and Balaam are rebuked by a divine voice, Paul by a celestial Christ and Balaam by an angel, hinting that Paul's vision might be a literary construct rather than an authentic divine encounter. Like Balaam's donkey, the companion's partial perception of these events, seeing the angel before him, Paul's companions hear a voice but see no one, casting doubt on the exclusivity and authenticity of Paul's personal revelation. There is a departure from established teachings also, where the author's use of Balaam's framework, a figure known for leading Israel astray, suggests Paul's radical theological shift from the Jerusalem apostles' teachings may be misleading. The celestial Christ of Paul as a mythic construct also plays into this, because by framing Paul's vision-based Christ, divorced from Jesus' earthly ministry, within Balaam's narrative, the author hints that Paul's message may reflect mythic fabrication rather than inspired truth. Paul is not a legitimate prophet. The Paul character is not a legitimate apostle. The Paul character is not a legitimate mind concerning the original movement's main character. We can know this not because I'm saying this, because the author is framing through literary structure the Paul character and the introduction to them according to Balaam's narrative traveling structure. We have to see these parallels and contrast them, because if we're not going to be able to pick up what the actual intention of the author writing the book of Acts is. We should. We shouldn't be holding on to these same childish narratives, right? Because we have the text in front of us. So we have to be able to discern more than what is traditional. We have to be able to discern more than where the legacy of our belief is tied to. We have to look at what's going on there from a literary perspective, how the authors are getting their information, how they're piecing and placing them together. Because the literary construct, again, all that my blog post was about, reflects a nature in the Paul character that is deviant, in whose machination is not for uplifting, but for infiltrating for the purpose of degrading. And the job is done perfectly by them. So in conclusion, Paul's vision and Balaam's story, it's a constructed narrative. Paul's story. Constructed. Never really happened. It parallels Balaam's story for the purpose of raising questions about how authentic the Paul character is. It's the only reason it's there. The narrative draws literary and theological connections, sure, but these parallels and connections suggest that Paul is actually a false prophet. Paul's influence on the Christian theory's origin therefore invites our critical reevaluation. Traditional assumptions about his apostolic authority, they are challenged, and especially by the very author of the book of Acts themselves. So I wanted to make this presentation for those that were commenting to get more clarity on this Paul character, because I enjoy talking about the Paul character. I enjoy digging into the philosophical context that this character is, and the most importantly for me, the literary construct and the literary devices that the authors writing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John use to get across the philosophical connotation of the characters that they're writing about. They're taking essences from other stories and they're placing them onto their main characters. What travels with their main characters are the essence that is attached to the former stories that they're getting these characterizations and categorizations from. We can't miss that. And so it was completely necessary, and I appreciate and love the interaction that you were all doing. And I enjoy all of the comments. And so this one presentation completely necessary so that we can, see, so that I can better explain more, although briefly, yet this is pretty packed, of the character that Paul is and the initial role that he played on the movement that he first infiltrated, took over, and then took out of this dimension and realm, a movement from a literary point of view that the author writing the book of Acts sees as completely negligent and detrimental to everything positive as it relates to the actual main character of the original Jesus movement.